Morning. With me now is Dame Sara Khan, who wrote this report. Dame Sara, thank you for joining us today on GB News. You say that 3/4 of people can't express their views. What do you mean?
So what I describe in my report is this phenomenon called freedom-restricting harassment, which is when people experience or witness threatening, intimidatory or abusive harassment, either online or offline, which is then intended to make individuals or institutions self-censor out of fear. And so what our polling shows is that around 3/4 of the British public feel that they cannot share their personal opinion in public out of fear of receiving freedom-restricting harassment. And you'll be aware that there's been a lot of debate over the last couple of months, even years, about how parliamentarians and those in public life have been at the forefront of such abuse and harassment. What my report shows for the first time is that this is a much broader phenomenon where people such as academics and teachers, counsellors, journalists, civic society activists, people working in the arts and cultural sector are experiencing this awful kind of freedom-restricting harassment, which is not only stifling individual liberty, but it's undermining social cohesion and eroding democratic rights and freedoms in our society.
It's a kind of chilling effect, isn't it, on our democracy? What are examples of that, everyday examples?
So I spoke to a former leader of a council, for example, who told me that she has received thousands of death threats directly to her, but also on online forums where people said that they would gang rape and traffic her 2-year-old daughter. She makes her 2-year-old daughter sleep by a fireproof blanket because a previous councillor had her property firebombed. I mean, that is just one out of many examples I heard. I heard about a civic society organisation, a director of an NGO, of a civic society organisation who regularly receives death threats because of her work to counter hate crime, and how her staff have left their work and jobs because of fear of their lives. She has to change her route to work every day because she fears being attacked. I heard constant examples like this, and again, across the board from different professions. And it's really deeply concerning, and it's something we have to do because I worry is going to erode our freedoms.
They sound illegal, though, making a threat against a 2-year-old child to deport them or get them out of the country. That surely must be an illegal threat.
Well, I think many of the cases I saw, I think they are. But what many victims, again, they told me repeatedly, was that the police are saying this hasn't crossed any criminal threshold. It might be because some of this behaviour is taking place on online forums and is not being sent directly to the victim. That doesn't lessen the impact on victims who are seeing this behaviour online that's being directed towards them. So again, this is why I'm saying, as one of my recommendations to the government, is that all 39 police forces in England should have a police officer who specialises in harassment legislation, malicious communications as well, that are able to provide support to victims because they are often overlooked and not necessarily even seen as victims of this harassment.
Who are the people making these threats?
So that's a very good question, and I'm afraid we don't have the full picture of who these perpetrators are. It is definitely the case that there are extremists, whether far-right Islamists, even Sikh fundamentalists and others who are engaged in this behaviour. But what my evidence is showing is it's a much broader phenomenon. It is not just people who are engaged in extremism, it's people who have a clear intolerance to other people because of their political opinion, because of the job that they do. And they have such a high level of intolerance, they think it's justifiable to send people death threats or rape threats or to engage in doxing behaviour where people upload and share people's personal information as a way to intimidate other people. And I think trying to understand that phenomenon is something we need to do a lot more.
And the targets are people in everyday public life, counsellors, school teachers, academics.
I think what's so insidious about it is that it's affecting people from all walks of life. So, for example, existing data shows that 7 out of 10 journalists are afraid to report on certain stories because they are afraid of receiving violence, threats and harassment. Now, that's going to undermine press and journalistic freedom in this country. When 9 out of 10 counsellors say that they're experiencing harassment and abuse and intimidation, and therefore more than a quarter are unwilling to take office because of that's going to restrict the level of representation we have at local government level. There are similar figures in the arts and cultural sector and so forth, which is all going to reduce the vibrant life of our plural democracy. That is something we have to stand up and push back against.
You mentioned there the case of the school in Batley where a teacher had to go into hiding for discussing and dealing with, looking at with the children, a caricature of the Prophet Muhammad. How many other Batleys are there?
Well, I can tell you there have been lots of teachers who've experienced threats and abuse. I mean, I had many teachers contact me describing this level of fear that they have. And there's a new polling out recently that showed that teachers are very fearful about teaching some of these issues because they worry about the backlash that they're going to experience. The problem we have at the moment is that the Department for Education don't collect this level of data. So we don't actually know the full scale of it. I think that this is just the tip of the iceberg. When you speak to the NEU and other unions that deal with teachers, they have told me that this is a growing problem. So I think this is something we have to tackle. And, let's be clear, this was somebody who was teaching a lesson that was part of the national curriculum, that was signed off by the local authority. And he was hounded out of his job and forced into hiding in our country in the 21st century. That is totally and utterly unacceptable in a free and democratic society like ours.
Have you met that teacher?
Yes, I have on a number of occasions.
And is he still in hiding, and is he scared?
So he is still in hiding. The impact of what happened to him is, I have to say, devastating. It's not just impacted him, it's impacted his family, his children. As I write in the report, he suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder because of what happened to him. At the time of the incident, which is exactly 3 years ago today, he felt suicidal not only because of the incident and the threats to him, but because of the failure of local agencies and authorities to help him, which compounded his sense of suicidal thoughts.
On that, and a question from my colleague Michelle Dewberry at GB News, should he get compensation?
Well, look, that's a question for him, really. I don't think I'm the right person to ask him that. That is something, that's something that and I hope he's getting legal advice on that. But I just think, looking at this from a much more broader perspective, we have to do far more to support academics, journalists, teachers, people just getting about living their lives in our free society to ensure that they are not victims, which is why I'm calling on the government to recognise officially this freedom-restricting harassment and to ensure that we have greater support for victims of freedom-restricting harassment, which includes making sure that the Victims Code recognises victims of freedom-restricting harassment, because as is the case with the Batley teacher, he was not even seen as a victim of crime despite his whole life changing overnight, nor was he given any provisions that were set out in the Victims Code.
Is it a question of teaching materials so you can teach about Islam and discuss the Prophet Muhammad and not get these threats?
Well, let's be very clear about the lesson he was teaching. This was a lesson that is in the national curriculum. The curriculum encourages teachers to teach about controversial issues like blasphemy, like free speech. And his whole lesson was about, you will inevitably come across things that you find offensive. Now, how do you deal with that? And he was talking about, in a democracy, you deal with that through debate and dialogue. What you don't do is engage in threatening and abusive behaviour, which is sadly what exactly happened to him. So again, the whole purpose of this debate is incredibly important, that we cannot allow our differences, no matter how passionate we may feel about some of these issues, that we then descend into a level of extreme threats and violence. That is totally and utterly unacceptable, and I suspect the vast majority of the public would agree with that.
Do you need you or someone else to set out what are British values, what our values are acceptable, what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable in this kind of social media age?
Well, I think to a certain degree we know what our values are. I mean, what I make clear in my report is that no matter what our differences are, whether cultural, religious, wider political opinions and beliefs, we are defined in this country by the hard-won rights of democratic rights and freedoms that our country has fought for centuries. That's what defines us as a nation. That's what marks us out from authoritarian countries, this vibrant, plural democracy where, yes, we may hold different opinions, we may passionately disagree on all kinds of different issues, but there comes a point where if you start issuing death threats and rape threats, that is totally and utterly unacceptable. And by doing that, what we are doing is undermining the very democratic norms of our country, and it poses a serious threat to our democracy, which we must push back against.
And just finally, Dame Sara Khan, you want a new office for social cohesion and democratic resilience. Will that cost lots of money?
Well, I mean, money, how do you put a cost on protecting our democratic rights and freedoms? For me, the central problem we have very little intelligence and data on this issue. The government is not collecting. We have no infrastructure in place to deal with these chronic, cohesive threats, these insidious threats that are slowly eroding our democratic rights and freedoms. That will affect all of us in this country. It's a basic foundational premise, and I think an infrastructure that this country needs, and that's why I'm calling on the government to establish such an office.